like to start with the beginning. I'd like to go back even before the Baseline Mansionization Ordinance was ever invented. Why was it created in the first place back in 2008?
Well, I think simply because even by 2008, there were enough concerned constituents, voters, engaged people, and so forth around the city who were raising the issue that it was unavoidable. In my neighborhood, Beverly Grove, we really saw it coming around 2004, the first evidence of mansionization in our neighborhood. And we could see it blocks away in Beverly Hills and knew that it was going to be spilling over any time, and indeed it did. So we started working on it in Beverly Grove early and often, and there were obviously plenty of other folks as well. At the time, the Planning Commission was headed by Jane Usher, who was one of the most savvy, sympathetic, thoughtful, enlightened people ever to be associated with that body. And it was certainly in part due to her leadership that they even took up the issue at all. Sadly, by the time it made its way all the way through, it was watered down beyond recognition. So we ended up in 2008 with something that really sets a baseline for mansionization in name only. The difference between the McMansions that were built before and after is virtually nil.
Yeah, because when you hear about BMO, you always hear it attached to the word loopholes.
Right, and that's certainly a big part of the story. To begin with, the baseline mansionization starts with a base floor area ratio that is excessive. I don't know if everyone is familiar with that, but most zoning sets size limits based on the relationship of the structure to its lot, and that's the ratio, that's the floor area ratio. If you look at other cities that have done mansionization ordinances, they will very often set that floor ratio at about 35% of the lot. So your structure, however many stories, 1 story or 2 story, whatever, will be maybe 35 or so % of your size of your lot. In LA, the Baseline Mansionization Ordinance started in the smaller urban lots like Beverly Grove and a lot of the older established neighborhoods at 50%, which is generous to begin with. Then, on top of that, are these loopholes that you can absolutely drive, well, not a truck, but a McMansion through.
Yeah.
So, 2 of them, well, actually more than 2, but 2 of the key problems are bonuses. One was for green building. So you could get 20% more floor space if you used bamboo flooring or, something. Problematic both because it's self-defeating in that this larger house is absolutely going to consume a lot more materials and a lot more energy, and because in due course there were other regulations that required those measures anyway, so they were being rewarded for something they didn't have to do in a way that defeated the purpose. There were other bonuses for things like articulation, so that you didn't have a single flat front, or certain kinds of setbacks so that the second story would be a little bit smaller in the footprint than the first story. And in theory, those are good, but again, the bonus was excessive. 20% is a lot of square footage. And the developers found ways to meet the requirements that really didn't end up doing what they were supposed to do. Which kind of takes us, if I may stick with this just for a moment, to related issues, transparency and enforcement. So the process, huge issues, really on pretty much everything in LA, but specifically on this, you can't even get a look at the plans for the McMansion next door, and any waivers or bonuses or exemptions or anything that are granted are done, I think the word is administratively, whatever, behind closed doors. There is no real oversight. So we have no way of knowing whether there was, even to the extent there is some valid underlying condition being met, whether it was ever met. And that's a problem. So we ended up with great big honkin' houses that violate the scale and the character of their neighborhood and impose on their immediate neighbors in ways that are really unfortunate.
Were you part of this process when the original ordinance was being devised and drafted?
Yes. Well, first of all, we had started a campaign in Beverly Grove for an overlay to protect our neighborhood from mansionization. Our campaign actually started in 2004. It ended up taking 10 years, who knew, but there we are. In addition, we were working with the Planning Commission and attending hearings and doing everything that we could, but a lot of it ended up happening behind closed doors, and hey presto, when the final ordinance was put out there for a vote, it was not what the city needed. It was made even worse at the time because the chair of the Plum Committee was, as it happened, our council member, Jack Weiss, and he was very, very sympathetic to developers, to say the least. So he ended up taking what was already an ineffectual ordinance and hollowing it out even further.
Wow. So then we've got 2008, we've got this watered down ordinance filled with loopholes. And then let's talk, I'm thinking out loud, but where was Beverly Grove in terms of trying to get their reduced floor area district at that time in 08?
Well, we had
Or was that a result of the fact that you saw that the BMO as written was not going to help your situation?
Right. We had actually managed in 2006 to get an interim control ordinance to give us some protection in anticipation of the Baseline Mansionization Ordinance being passed. However, again, Jack Weiss was our council member. He was very unsympathetic. Our ICO was meaningless. The Baseline Mansionization Ordinance itself was essentially meaningless. And the developers continued to make hay, and our neighborhood, Beverly Grove, was sort of ground zero. You were by no means the only neighborhood, but we were hit very, very hard. So we simply continued to campaign and campaign and campaign, and when Paul Koretz won the seat, he heard loud and clear from a lot of people. He knew exactly what the story was. And really hats off, because there was also very entrenched opposition, and it was pretty vicious. And he took the fire and he persevered, and he got an overlay for Beverly Grove, but it took a really long time. Partly, again, because the planning department is in no hurry to do this. They really aren't.
No, that's one of the points I want to get into.
Partly because it really is a nuisance as a process goes, and partly because it's not clear that there is a real enlightened view on all of this from the top. But in any case, we did finally get an overlay in 2013, and it gave us the strongest protection in the city.
What had happened, though, in those 5 years?
Oh my God, in those 5 years, we ended up with probably close to 10% of properties in our neighborhood being ravaged, tear-downs, McMansions, whatever. And meanwhile, the mansionization spread more and more to other parts of the city as well.
To the softer, unprotected.
Yes, that's
areas.
right. In fact, when the BMO was passed in 2008, the commission said, well, we can see how it's going, because, we obviously spoke up at that time and said, look, this is not adequate. And they said, well, let's see how it goes for a year or two. We can always come back to it. Well, they did not come back to it, and we saw how it went for a year or two or three or four or five, and it has just been something of a snowball.
Now the city often uses the excuse that given the recession in 08 and 09 that resulted in staff cutbacks.
Right.
That was a factor too, that they didn't have the manpower.
Right. I've heard a lot of that. Now, I don't have X-ray vision and I don't have a crystal ball, but I do know that they tend to develop processes for getting overlays that are so overcomplicated that you would need tremendous staffing. If indeed they ever took the sort of simple, straightforward approach to fixing regulations, they wouldn't need the resources that they acquire.
How effective has, once Beverly Grove got its reduced floor area overlay?
I would say it's really good. Now, one of the things that's a little bit of a tough pill to swallow for everybody in Beverly Grove and any other area where they get fresh regulation is there is a pipeline, and it gets stuffed to the maximum by developers and speculators who are anticipating, that the shoe is going to drop. And it takes a while for that to work through the system. So
if they had their applications or permits before these laws were enacted,
This stuff does not stop on a dime. And as it turns out, Los Angeles, surprise, is one of the worst in terms of having a really, really excessively long shelf life for permits. I got educated on this a little bit from a veteran of the Department of Building and Safety. First of all, you are golden once the check that goes in with your application clears. Okay, so
once the check clears, not that the plans don't have to be approved.
Plans have to be approved.
Crazy.
Okay, and then you have 18 months. 18 months to do this, even if the week later, there's new regulation that would prohibit what you've done.
So then after the RFA was approved in Beverly Grove, you had to sit there for the next year and a half.
And still see, absolutely. And in fact, even the 18 months can be renewed or extended under certain circumstances. So it's crazy. Yeah. This is a subject for another day, but Ellen really needs to work on that as well. But in any case, it worked to the extent that, as we anticipated, there is a market for appropriate homes that are suited both to the environment and to the needs of modern families. And you can renovate, you can build from the ground up, you can still make, under the new ordinance in Beverly Grove, a spacious, comfortable, modern home for your family. And there are folks who have done that. And we see them, and some of them are finished and going on the market, some of them have already been bought. It did not... Our goal never was to stop progress and to freeze everything and, put it into resin. We simply want thoughtful, appropriate development, and that's what we got.
So at what point, obviously, it seems to me as soon as the Baseline Mansionization Ordinance was passed in 2008, did the effort to reform it begin immediately, or?
Not quite immediately.
Were you all exhausted and took a break and then... rallied the troops?
No, I think something like that. But part of it, too, is that you have to have certain conditions. You have to have someone in city government who is willing to go against the flow and take a stand. And in LA, this is,
it's a go along, get along culture.
Right. So in Beverly Grove, we had our hands plenty full, as I'm sure you now understand with your campaign, just keeping that on track. Once we got our RFA, we started hearing from neighborhoods all over the city saying, oh my God, we're experiencing what you did, how do we do it, blah, 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 blah. And it was clear to us that addressing mansionization citywide only with overlay districts doesn't really make sense. So while we understand the value of the overlay district, we also felt that it was really important to get in there and set a baseline that made some kind of sense, in part because that way, while the various neighborhoods are pursuing their RFAs or their HPOZs or whatever they're looking for, they will not be ruined beyond recognition. And the way I've come to think of it is, it's at The Baseline Mansionization Ordinance sets a speed limit. And in Los Angeles, that speed limit is currently about 193 miles an hour. It's insane. So we need to ratchet that down so that our speed limit is maybe 55 or whatever the hell makes sense. Okay? And then the various neighborhoods, well, we need a turn lane, or we need to retime our lights, or, you know, whatever it is. Again, metaphorically.
But they're getting specific to their...
getting, you know, things that meet their specific needs and the character of their neighborhood, which we absolutely support and applaud. But it makes no sense to be trying to put Band-Aids on all over the city when we have an ordinance that is not working. So that was what we put our attention to, because we had the luxury at this point of time. We had nailed down protection for Beverly Grove, so a few of us who are veterans of that campaign went to Paul Koretz and said, you know, you've already taken a lot of heat and you've already shown a lot of leadership. How about let's deal with this citywide? And of course he was hearing from a lot of other folks in his district and outside screaming for relief, and there he went. It's been over a year since he submitted a motion. That motion, I should probably stop for a minute and say, I think is very well thought through. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's enforceable, and it basically does two things. One is it ratchets down the base ratio a little bit, not dramatically, takes a little bit of the air out, and the other is it closes the loopholes. And when you do that, you have something that not only works better, but it's much easier to enforce. I mean, it's simple math. You know, this side by the that side is your floor area, and you're not exempting things and so forth, because it just doesn't make sense. One of the things that we didn't talk about in terms of the shortcomings of the current ordinance is the exemptions. Up to 400 square feet of attached garage is not counted as floor area when they do the calculation.
That's one of the most controversial loopholes.
It is, I think it's the most serious in that this is a very big volume. 400 square feet is a lot of space to not be counting. And it also incentivizes attached garages put onto the front of the house, which is fine in some areas, but in a lot of the older established neighborhoods is just you couldn't come up with something that is less consistent with or respectful of the character of the neighborhood.
Indeed. In
addition, it means you don't have a driveway, because the way our code is set up, if you do an attached garage, it is 99.9% it's going to be at the back of the lot, and that means you're going to have a driveway running the full length of the lot, and that's going to give you a nice little breather between the houses. That goes away.
Well, it also provides you with parking for guests.
And it provides you with parking for guests. You know, so the argument that the attached garage exemption is necessary because it helps with parking is nonsense. A lot of the garages aren't used for parking anyway. They do double wide cuts into the curb, so you end up with less street parking than you had before.
Exactly. Et
cetera, et cetera. It's a mess, and it is absolutely indefensible.
Once you started talking to Koretz about reforming BM, how long did it take him to put together
That's a good question. I'm thinking not very long.
Not very long. He was very responsive then.
Yes.
And so he introduced, explain it technically. What did he do with this?
He introduced a council motion, and the council adopted it in May of 2014. And that motion, it was a single page, and it essentially identifies the problem areas, and in sort of diplomatic speak says, you know, these are things that we need to reconsider and reevaluate and are problematic and so forth, and basically identifies all the areas that need to be addressed. And again, it's such a simple, straightforward fix that you can go into the existing ordinance. In fact, one of our group has done this, and redline the portions of the existing ordinance that are a problem, and do absolutely nothing else and end up with a good ordinance. I mean, you don't,
Well,
we're not inventing the wheel.
If it's that simple, why has it not been enacted?
That's a really good question. All right, first of all, politically, it's not that simple for a variety of reasons. One of them being, I am assured that you really do have to have outreach meetings and, you know, get input from the community and so forth. So I'll take that at face value. Okay, let's say that you have to. Then we have heard again and again, you know, the issue about not having enough staffing and not having the resources and whatever. I would have to say that it is not clear that there is real political will at high levels in the planning department to deal with this. However, there has been a lot of pushback, and I think we actually now are about to have it happen. Again, partly because not just all the folks in Miracle Mile, but people all over the city have been speaking up, not only individually, but homeowners associations, residents associations, neighborhood councils, and, you know, really making it clear that we need relief from mansionization.
You think you've got that critical mass now?
I think that we do. However, I know from sad experience that there is never a moment to relax and just watch this thing take its course, because that doesn't work. We have to keep their feet to the fire. The city, as I think you know, set up some interim control ordinances to protect about 20 of the hardest hit neighborhoods, including Miracle Mile. You know, that has a shelf life of, at this point, about another year and a half, give or take, 20 months, something like that. So something needs to happen by the end of that. The staffing to actually do the amendments of the Baseline Mansionization Ordinance is supposedly going to be in place around the end of this month. So they should be truly getting underway. But we need to stay.
Let me just interrupt for 1 second. So sure. Mr. Koretz introduced this motion to reform the BMO when?
May of 2014.
And now we are in July of
2015.
And
correct.
They're just now adding or finding the staff to begin.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it was at first there wasn't funding, then there was funding, but they had to complete some kind of arcane interview process.
And there's no way of saying how many McMansions have been built or in the pipeline since then.
Right, but Department of Building, DBA, at any rate, it clearly, based on city records, has accelerated dramaticamente.
Because they know the law is going to be changed.
Yes, absolutely. So again, stuffing the pipeline.
It's a beat the clock.
Right, beat the clock.
Amazing.
So what it really comes down to is anybody who cares about the issue has got to be ready to speak up and show up. Because there are going to be hearings, and there are going to be workshops, and there are going to be
the whole kabuki theater of city governance.
Right, and there is no question, the developers are going to push back as hard as they can. Now, most of the houses that have been built in Beverly Grove and in a lot of the other neighborhoods, they're not being built by Kaufman and Broad, so we're not talking about big developers. This isn't Kasdan. However, developers don't like the prospect of any regulation whatsoever, and they are marshaling their forces and pushing back, and, you know, again, the campaign of misinformation about what this all involves. So I think it's important for people to, if they need to, you know, take a moment or two and get well informed about it. If it's a matter of going to the MMRA website or the No More McMansions in LA website, and just understand that we are really talking about sensible reform. We're talking about being able to renovate and expand and build in ways that are perfectly appropriate. We just want to stop mansionization, and it's not impossible.
What do you see now that you've gone this far with the reform? What's the game play now? What's your super objective?
From where I'm sitting is to continue to broaden and diversify the support for the ordinance, because I know how the developers and their lobbyists work, and I know how their propaganda machine works. And one of the things, I mean, they will say anything. They will say it's bad for property values, which is total nonsense. They will say it's a rich person's problem, also total nonsense. One of the ICOs in advance of an HPOZ is in Boyle Heights. We just got support from Elysian Park, Echo Park Neighborhood Council. The neighborhood council that represents Leimert Park and Baldwin Hills and Crenshaw area is looking very seriously at this issue. We need to keep reaching out, and we need to keep talking, and we need to make it clear that mansionization makes a quick buck for the developers at the expense of the city. They are strip mining Los Angeles. Okay?
I think that's a good way to put it.
And in the same way that people in South LA and East LA also want good schools and clean water and clean air, they want livable, intact neighborhoods, they want community cohesion, and they want stable long-term property values, not the kind of spiky stuff that goes on when somebody makes a killing on the McMansion and the house next door loses $50,000 or $100,000 in value because now it's living next door to, like, you know,
to Kmart.
To Kmart or something, yeah. Are completed.
Well, then let me put it this way. Will we have reform of the BMO before these interim control ordinances expire?
Well, we jolly well better, let me put it that way.
Yeah.
Now, I think at this point, the question isn't so much will they do it. I think they have been embarrassed and maneuvered into the point where they have to do something. But what? And I know from what I'm already hearing that there is pushback from developers and lobbyists and so forth. For example, they want to protect the exemption for the 400 square feet of attached garage, and they have the same tired old arguments to do it. So that's why I'm saying we need to keep pushing back over and over and over, because at every single hearing, at every single juncture, the developers and their lobbyists will try to take the teeth out of the ordinance as amended. They've already done it once. They've shown they can do it. And if we are not on top of it and we don't speak up and we don't show up, that is what will happen.
How do you keep your enthusiasm and energy after doing this for so long? And it is a myth of Sisyphus in a way. You pushed the original BMO up the hill, and just to see it roll right back down all over everybody. And then this long struggle, and Beverly Grove was a battleground to get your RFA. And now, years later, you're back in battle to reform what you thought was going to be fixed in 08. How do you keep your...
Well, I think there are a couple of answers. One is that I'm just bloody-minded. Just, you know, I get a bit in my teeth, and it's not that easy to get it out again.
Yeah.
But part of it is, well, so what is the alternative? Throw in the towel? I know what that brings us.
Well,
I mean, it's clear.
We watch our neighborhoods just disappear.
So, you know, yes, you can be tired of it. I mean, I've had people come up to me and say they were tired of it, and I'm thinking, you're tired of it? Can you imagine how tired of it I am at this point? But, you know, okay. So, you get tired of it, but you still have to do it. And my feeling, whether it's neighborhood activism or world affairs or family affairs or whatever it is, I'm not entitled to complain about it if I'm not prepared to do something.
Hear, hear. Yeah.
So
if we were, and we probably will, but if we were sitting here again 6 months from now, what will change with this tune, or what will be different? Are you hoping in 6 months?
Well, I'm hoping in 6 months that they will at least have begun, if not completed, the outreach where there are supposedly something like 5 districts in the city where they have to have meetings and take input and so forth. that there will be something for us to look at and sink our teeth into, and we probably will need to sink our teeth into it.
Well,
because I think we can assume that we will not end up. Oh, that's what I forgot to do.
Oh, is that your phone? That's good. Well, that's kind of our cue to wrap up.
Right. We won't end up with a good ordinance if we don't fight for it.
Well, then I guess we have a date in about 6 months'
Okay.
time. Okay, thank you, Shelley, very much.